Imagine you're living in the Middle Ages, a time when illness was often a death sentence, and doctors had no antibiotics, no vaccines, and no real understanding of germs. So how did people survive everything from fevers to infections? What strange and bizarre remedies did they turn to in their fight for survival? Believe it or not, some of these odd treatments actually worked. From the power of garlic to the surprising benefits of honey and even more unusual remedies. Medieval medicine may have seemed bizarre, but it had some surprising successes. Medicine at the time was a blend of superstition, trial and error, and the occasional stroke of genius. People didn't fully understand the causes of illnesses, so they turned to creative and sometimes odd remedies to cure ailments. Garlic has long been praised for its health benefits, but did you know medieval doctors treated it as a cure-all for everything from the plague to bad breath? Without modern medicine, garlic served as their pharmacy, valued for its healing powers even though they didn't understand the science behind it. Packed with allicin, a compound with antibacterial and antifungal properties, garlic was indispensable. Medieval people didn't know about bacteria, but they saw its effectiveness firsthand. They used garlic in countless ways, raw, cooked, or mixed into remedies, to fight infections, boost immunity, and soothe wounds. During the Black Death, people carried garlic to ward off disease, believing its pungent smell offered protection. But it wasn't just superstition. Garlic was also ingested to cleanse the body. Therefore, it became both a charm and a practical remedy. For respiratory issues, garlic was boiled into broths to clear congestion, while digestive troubles were treated with garlic-infused tonics. While it might seem unusual today, garlic truly earned its reputation as a medieval medical marvel. Taken from the Greek for boring, in the Middle Ages, trepanation, the act of drilling or cutting a hole into the skull, was used as a desperate solution to treat a variety of ailments, such as severe headaches, epilepsy, and even mental illness. People believed these conditions were caused by evil spirits trapped inside the body. But while their understanding of medicine was rudimentary, they genuinely thought that creating an opening in the skull would release the harmful forces causing the symptoms. Medieval medicine at the time had limited knowledge of head trauma, and physicians often turned to trepanation as a way to treat head injuries. The idea was that drilling a hole in the skull would relieve pressure, drain fluids, or release bad humours that might be causing damage. The procedure was painful and highly risky. Infection or death was a common outcome. It was often seen as a last resort, performed only when other remedies like herbal treatments or bloodletting failed. Surprisingly, archaeological evidence suggests some patients survived trepanation, as their skulls show signs of healing. This resilience makes it one of the more fascinating and terrifying glimpses into medieval medicine. Dogs weren't just loyal companions. They were believed to have healing powers. For example, black dogs were sometimes placed next to sick children because it was believed they could absorb the illness and carry it away. Touching a dog or letting it sleep near an afflicted person was thought to transfer the disease, leaving the human healed. These practices often had no scientific basis and relied heavily on faith or coincidence. Dogs became symbols of comfort and hope in a world without antibiotics or modern medicine. Their presence not only offered emotional solace, but also reinforced the belief that nature, in all its forms, had the power to heal. This reliance on dogs for medical purposes might seem strange today, but it reminds us of how humans have always turned to their furry companions in times of need, whether for warmth, love, or even a bit of medieval magic. Honey wasn't just a sweet treat. It was a prized remedy in the medical world. People believed it had powerful healing properties and used it to treat everything from wounds to sore throats. While this may seem questionable, they were surprisingly onto something. Honey's natural antibacterial properties, thanks to its low water content and the presence of hydrogen peroxide, made it effective in preventing infections. Physicians and healers applied honey to cuts and burns to keep them clean and promote healing. They also mixed it into herbal remedies to make bitter medicines more palatable. Honey, therefore, became a staple in medieval medical kits and an essential ingredient for healing both inside and out. It's fascinating to think that while much of medieval medicine relied on superstition, their use of honey was grounded in practical benefits we still recognize today. Sweet, sticky, and surprisingly effective. The bark of a willow tree was a go-to remedy for treating pain and fevers. Healers would strip the bark, grind it into a powder, and brew it into a tea. It would ease ailments like headaches, joint pain, and inflammation. Doctors didn't know why it worked. They simply trusted the observations of earlier civilizations, like the Greeks and Romans, who swore by its effectiveness. Unbeknownst to them, willow bark contains salicylin, or salicylic acid, a compound that acts much like modern aspirin. This natural pain reliever was particularly useful for treating conditions like arthritis or the aches caused by illnesses such as the plague. Despite their limited understanding of chemistry, medieval healers had inadvertently stumbled upon a natural remedy that science would later refine and replicate in modern medicine. One of the more familiar remedies of the Middle Ages was leeches. The creatures were a staple of medical treatment, used to balance the humours in the body, an idea central to medieval medicine. Physicians believed that illness often resulted from an excess of blood, so they employed leeches to draw it out and restore balance. Bloodletting with leeches might sound like the ultimate medieval nightmare, but while physicians' understanding of human biology was deeply flawed, leeches weren't entirely useless. Their saliva contains anticoagulants and anesthetics, which can improve blood flow and reduce clotting. Leeches were applied to treat everything from fevers and infections to headaches and even high blood pressure. Their slimy efficiency became a symbol of medieval medicine. It's remarkable to think that while their world was full of mystery and superstition, medieval medical treatment was sometimes surprisingly effective, although in most cases, they didn't know it at the time. Imagine stepping into a medieval city. Bustling markets, grand cathedrals, the hum of daily life. But behind the charm, a gauntlet of disease, crime, and filth that could make modern urban stress seem like a holiday. So, how did people survive? How did they navigate a world where a simple cut could mean infection, where thieves lurked in dark alleys, and where the wrong word in the wrong place could land you in serious trouble? A medieval city wasn't just streets and buildings. It was a living, breathing organism, teetering constantly between prosperity and chaos. And if you wanted to thrive, or even just make it to the next day, you had to know how to survive. In the early Middle Ages, if you were an ordinary person, chances were you lived in a rural village, a religious community, or on feudal land. Why? Because that's where 90% of the population was. Life revolved around the manor, where peasants and serfs worked at the land under the watchful eye of the local lord. And if you wanted to leave, maybe strike out on your own or even just get married, you couldn't just pack up and go. You needed the lord's permission. No approval, no freedom. Now, fast forward to the 12th and 13th centuries. Something changes. Cities start to boom. Paris, London, Venice. These places aren't just growing, they're thriving. Trade is flourishing. Markets are expanding, and suddenly, the city is where the action is. But there's a problem. Cities need workers, and feudal lords aren't exactly eager to let their labor force walk away. Authorities come up with a deal. Move to a city, stay for a year and a day, and you're free. Just like that. No more feudal obligations. No more asking permission. Now, before you start celebrating, there's a catch. Your old lord doesn't exactly want to lose free labour. He can send a bailiff after you to drag you back. So if you're a runaway serf in the big city, you keep a low profile, stay out of trouble, and hope nobody recognises you. Imagine walking through the streets of a medieval city, say London. The air is thick with the scent of roasting meat from a nearby market stall, and the rhythmic clatter of horseshoes on cobblestone. But beneath that lively surface, there's something else. Something far less pleasant. The stench. Because in a city with thousands of people and no plumbing, where does all the waste go? Well, it goes everywhere. With no sewage systems, people simply threw waste, human and otherwise, right into the street. And when it rained, that waste mixed into a delightful sludge that ran between houses and shops, straight down to the nearest river, where people also got their drinking water. Medieval cities became the perfect breeding ground for illness. Now, let's say you were wealthy. Lucky you. You might have a private toilet, a privy, connected to a cesspit beneath your home. But these cesspits had a tendency to overflow. Authorities eventually had to hire men called gong farmers to dig out the filth and carry it outside the city. Not exactly a glamorous job. For everyone else though, waste went straight onto the streets or into chamber pots, which were then emptied, usually out of the window. So if you happened to be walking below at the wrong time, well, bad luck. And then there was the water problem. Wells and rivers were the main sources, but these were also prime locations for washing clothes, disposing of garbage, and yes, getting rid of waste. Therefore, drinking water wasn't exactly clean. People did sometimes boil it, but without germ theory, they didn't really understand why that helped. Many turned to beer and ale instead, which was often safer to drink. It also meant that for much of the day, everyone was slightly drunk. You've just arrived in the big city. Congratulations! Now, how are you going to make a living? Well, if you weren't afraid of a bit of hard work, you had plenty of options. Take blacksmiths, for example. They weren't just hammering out horseshoes, they were crafting swords, tools, and intricate metalwork that kept the city running. But swinging a hammer all day wasn't for the faint-hearted. It took years to master. And the same went for carpenters, who built everything from houses to fine furniture, and weavers whose hands turned thread into elaborate tapestries. Skilled labor like this wasn't something you picked up overnight. Which is why the apprentice system was everywhere. But you couldn't just walk in and start making masterpieces. You had to find a master, sign yourself up for years of grueling work, and maybe, if you were lucky, you'd one day open your own shop. It was a medieval version of climbing the corporate ladder, except with more blisters. Now, food. Everyone needs it. But making it was no easy task. If you were a baker, you spent your days sweating over a roaring oven, ensuring the fire was just right so the bread didn't burn. Butchers? Their job wasn't just about chopping meat, it was about making sure every single part of the animal was used. Waste nothing. And if you had a weak stomach, well, this probably wasn't the trade for you. Now, let's talk about barbers. Today, you'd go to one for a haircut. But in the medieval city, they were a whole different breed. If you had a toothache, needed surgery, or wanted a little bloodletting, you went to your local barber. That's right, haircuts and medieval medicine, all under one roof. And strangely enough, people actually trusted them. Medieval cities were hubs of trade, culture, and innovation. But with thousands of people crammed together, they were also magnets for crime. Keeping order was a constant challenge, especially without a centralized police force. Pickpockets, burglars, and street gangs thrived in the narrow, twisting alleyways. But authorities weren't going to let lawlessness take over. City watchmen patrolled after dark, curfews were enforced, and punishments were designed to be as public and terrifying as possible. So, living in a medieval city had its advantages, opportunities, trade, and culture. But crime, disease, fire, and a legal system that wasn't exactly forgiving made life unpredictable. If you wanted to survive, you needed street smarts, connections, and a little bit of luck. And that, of course, is how cities evolved into the bustling, complex metropolises we know today. But that's another story. Every morning, millions of us stand under a stream of hot water, lather up with perfumed soap, and scrub ourselves clean. It's so routine, you probably don't even think about it. But once upon a time, staying clean was anything but routine. In fact, the idea of daily washing would have seemed downright absurd. And yet, medieval people, peasants and nobles alike, weren't the filthy barbarians you've been led to believe. People bathed, they changed clothes, they even used perfume. But the reasons why, and how they did it, are tangled up in a web of religion, superstition, and good old-fashioned social hierarchy. So, what did they get right? What did they get horribly wrong? And how did it change the world? Let's take a closer look at medieval hygiene. It's the 14th century. You're a noble, you've got money, land, and a fancy title. But you haven't had a proper bath in weeks. Why? Because heating enough water for a full soak is an ordeal involving servants, firewood, and patience. So what do? Well, if you're lucky, you take a bath in a large wooden tub filled with warm water infused with herbs, lavender, rosemary, maybe even rose petals if you're feeling extravagant. And for some extra cleanliness, a linen cloth dipped in scented water, dabbed carefully across the skin. It's not exactly a modern spa, but in a world without deodorant, it'll do. Meanwhile, if you're a peasant, the equation changes. No servants, no rose petals, no tub. Instead, you find a river, a stream, or if you're really fancy, a wooden barrel filled with rainwater. Soap? A rough concoction made from animal fat and ashes. Harsh? Absolutely. Effective? Well, it's better than nothing. But here's where things get interesting. Bathhouses. Not just for the rich, but for anyone who could pay the entry fee. These were the medieval equivalent of a social club. A place to clean up, catch up on the latest gossip, and maybe even strike a business deal. That is, until things started to smell a little off. See, people started to notice that those who bathed frequently sometimes got sick. And during the Black Death, this led to a rather unfortunate conclusion. Maybe water was the problem. Maybe all this bathing was actually making people ill. The solution? Simple. Stop washing altogether. Instead, rub yourself with scented oils and powders. Layer on the perfume. Mask, don't clean. This little misunderstanding led to a fashion trend that lasted for centuries. Why wash when you can smell expensive? Which, by the way, is why your 18th century French aristocrat smelled more like a walking apothecary than a human being. This doesn't look like much, does it? Just a simple piece of linen. But in medieval Europe, this was the height of hygiene technology, if you could afford it. You see, the wealthy had a secret weapon in the battle against body odor: linen undergarments. Soft, light, and absorbent, they soaked up sweat and oil, keeping the outer layers clean. And since they were easy to wash, the rich simply changed their linens more often instead of washing their bodies. Meanwhile, the peasants wore wool or hemp, tough, practical, but not exactly breathable, and certainly not easy to wash. So instead of changing clothes daily, they made do with a simple trick: layers. By wearing a long tunic over a coarse shirt, they kept the worst of the dirt away from their skin, at least most of the time. But what about the smell? Well, they had a solution for that too. Herbs. Lavender, sage and mint were stuffed into pouches, sewn into garments, or simply rubbed on the skin. A medieval version of deodorant. Practical, cheap, and surprisingly effective. But it was about more than just hygiene. Clothes were a status symbol. If you were rich, you flaunted your wealth with layers of fine linen and wool dyed in vivid colors. Why? Because only the wealthy could afford to keep multiple sets of expensive clothing clean. This obsession with linen wasn't just about staying clean. It was about showing off. You see, linen was imported from Flanders, the best in Europe. The more you wore, the richer you looked. And because it was so absorbent, it made washing less necessary, which meant you could afford even more layers. A perfect cycle of wealth and status. The demand for clean linen created an entire industry. Hard-working women who washed and scrubbed with handmade soap, battling stains with lye and elbow grease. It was grueling work, but it also gave them a unique power. Access to the secrets of the nobility. After all, nothing reveals more about a person than their dirty laundry. Ah, the sweet smell of medieval progress. Or rather, the lack of it. You see, back in the Middle Ages, people didn't just live close to each other. They lived close to their waste, and they weren't exactly shy about it. If you were wealthy, you used a chamber pot. Basically, a portable toilet. Convenient? Yes. Hygienic? Well, that depended on where you emptied it. In most towns, that meant straight out of the window and into the street. And if you were unlucky enough to be walking by, well, you quickly learned to look up and step lively. But what about all the other waste? Food scraps, animal dung, broken pottery, it all ended up in the same place, the street. And with no underground sewage system, waste flowed through open gutters, mixing with rainwater and creating a stagnant, foul-smelling sludge. But as cities grew, the problem became impossible to ignore. More people meant more waste, and soon the streets were clogged. Local authorities introduced the first sanitation laws, banning waste dumping in public areas and creating designated refuse pits. In Paris, you could even be fined for tossing rubbish into the Seine. Forward thinking, right? And then came the muckrakers, medieval sanitation workers tasked with clearing the streets. Armed with shovels, carts, and a strong stomach, they hauled waste out of the cities, dumping it beyond the walls or selling it to farmers as fertilizer. Recycling medieval style. We've come a long way from tossing chamber pots into the street. Today, we scrub, rinse, flush, and disinfect, all in the name of hygiene. It's funny, isn't it? The messy struggle to manage waste did more than just clean the streets. It shaped cities, public health, and even the way we live today. Which just goes to show, history really is a load of, well, you get the idea.